They said people lined up outside of Madison Square Garden that day, not because they had tickets to the concert for Bangladesh, or at that point, George Harrison and friends, but because they just wanted to be nearby. There was electricity in the air. A Beatle was getting on stage for the first time since 1966, and the palpable excitement of this event was only overshadowed by the cause behind it. It only took 2 performances, of course by the biggest names in music, to raise about $250,000, with more coming. But no good deed goes unpunished, as George Harrison would learn mere days later as he began his years-long battle to bring relief to the people for Bangladesh. Hi, I'm Lars, and this is my land. In my land, I get to do pretty much whatever I want, and today I'm going to tell you the whole story behind the concert for Bangladesh. And you're going to listen, because it's my land. Welcome to Annoying Memos Land. Beep, 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 beep. If you're new here, I talk mostly about the Beatles, but sometimes I drop a 7-hour video on a TV show that I worked on for so long that if I don't mention it in every video I do, I will be forced to rectify my failure as a kamikaze pilot by going up against a giant ancient alien lizard. You didn't think I was gonna stop doing that just because I put out the Lost video, right? An important note that I will repeat later is that 7+ seconds of copyright music will lead to a copyright claim, and in my experience, it will become blocked from viewing anywhere. I have to play by YouTube's rules or else my videos don't exist. However, I offer more complete versions with actual music on my Patreon, patreon.com/LarsLand. I'd love it if you support me there, but if not, I'd absolutely love it if you'd like and subscribe and all of that jazz. That helps me so much. Now let's go back to my land. Relief for Bangladesh. Okay, when it comes to pronunciation, I grew up saying Bangladesh, and then as I started doing research for this, I keep hearing Bangladesh. So now I kind of go in between both, but I've been saying this wrong for so long that now it feels wrong, but the other way feels wrong, okay? Generally, I try to keep things as listenable as possible. I also like to do my chores while listening to idiots, but if there's extra info, and usually there is, it will be available on screen with a click, sounds like this. And if you want to get in the comments and be all me, it's not my fault if you miss the click. It's not my fault if you miss the click. There's no way around it, okay? This whole story, crazy is not really the word for it. It's got a little bit of everything, you know? It's drugs, illicit affairs, well-meaning idiots, charity fraud, 2 government tax investigations, and, of course, music. It's a pretty well-rounded event, and I'm gonna cover all of it. And if I'm gonna tell you all of that, then I need to talk about what caused this whole bizarre affair to happen. It's a case of one of these things is not like the other, because there is one more thing that this story has, and it's war. Oh, not fun, not cool. I want to talk about drugs and sex. Fine, I get it. I'm also a dumb American, okay? I understand. I've tried my best to keep things as simple as possible. I mean, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. I get it, okay? So if you want to skip ahead to when we start talking about the music, that's totally fine. But at least hear out the 2-sentence summary. And then, you know, if you're afraid of learning, you see the chapter things, you can skip it, dummy. Please do not accept this as your definition. Do not learn your non-Beatles history from me or Lost. Those are the 2 topics. Otherwise, a decades-long feud in East Pakistan created by the India partition eventually led to the Bengali Genocide and the Bengali Liberation War. In 1971, as the Bengali people fought for independence, people were dying of violence, starvation, and disease. Ravi Shankar, who's from the region, he had friends and family who were suffering. He went to George Harrison talking about possibly holding some sort of charity event. George said, go ahead, let's do it big and make $1 million. So if you don't want to hear the history, skip forward to do it big and make $1 million. You're welcome, dummy. So, listen, this is an incredibly simplified version of things. I now know enough to know that this is a very cursory explanation. However, I wanted to get into this just a little bit because I'm getting into everything else in this story, and it just felt wrong to ignore the brutal reality of the Bangladesh genocide in favor of talking about one of these musicians' habits. it seems weird. Breaking the sincerity to read directly from this script. Well, when Britain fucked off out of India in 1946, concerns about India, Pakistan, and the religious, cultural, and especially lingual barriers between them were solved via a partition. The partition separates East and West Pakistan. Regarding this topic specifically, I'm going to let Simon Whistler take a jab at it, assuming that copyright allows it. According to Twitter, he thinks it'll be okay.
Essentially, if British India was given its independence overnight without any changes, everyone figured that a civil war of some sort would have begun shortly after. The basic idea of partition was to split up British India into two separate countries, one for Muslims and one for Hindus. This idea had been floating around for a while and was originally known as the two-nation theory, in which each country would officially be a religious state, but this had seen a lot of backlash. Now, however, partition seemed like the perfect way to make sure that everybody got what they wanted. Well, except those who wanted a unified India, but that was pretty much out of the question at this point. The violence between the Muslims and the Hindus was already starting to escalate, and so, in the summer of 1947, the partition was officially announced. Within its territory, the borders of two new nations were carved out, the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan, separated along roughly religious fronts by what was called the Radcliffe Line. Interestingly, the Dominion of Pakistan was comprised of two separate geographic regions, one to the northwest of India called West Pakistan, and one to the northeast called East Pakistan. Now, you won't find East Pakistan on a map today, as it has since gained its independence and is now the country of Bangladesh.
In the late 1940s, anti-Bengali policy starts, and it's pretty insane. A lot of conversation will say Bengali Hindus. And while that is accurate, recently, very recently, as in like a couple weeks ago, there was conversation on whether or not it's most accurate to say Bengali genocide or like Bengali Hindus genocide. What is being found most recently is that all Bengali people, regardless of religion or what language they spoke, were targeted as a part of the genocide. So rather than saying Bengali Hindus, I will be saying Bengali people. Just saying. Okay, upon further inspection, I have figured out that this is still being heavily debated and kind of personally, actually, on the Wikipedia conversation page. I just wanted to mention that this is still being argued. This is still up for debate. This is still a conversation. I am apologizing for the misinformation, but that is how I spoke. The East Pakistan government was working to delegitimize or outlaw outright Bengali peoples and even their language. I mean, come on. They backpedaled on that, but come on. And this begins a mass migration of hundreds of thousands, and people started to die of disease, starvation, and of course, violence. Britain's decision to grant independence to India and get out sooner rather than later resulted in West Pakistan slowly suffocating the East. There are conflicts on the East side with little or no West Pakistani response in the 50s, again in the 60s, almost no help. East Pakistan has almost no political power or resources to deal with this civil war. Man-made atrocities aside, the Bola cyclone devastated Bangladesh and West Bengal on November 12, 1970. It was the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded and one of the world's deadliest humanitarian disasters. Not laughing because it's funny, laughing because it's crazy. At least 300,000 people died in the storm, and some estimates land around 500,000. So later in December, some political stuff happens. I'm not gonna try and screw that up. And it urges on what begins the Bangladesh genocide on March 25th and what begins the Bangladesh Liberation War on March 26th of 1971. 8 months, 2 weeks, 6 days. The Bangladesh genocide was perpetrated by the Pakistan Armed Forces during the Bangladesh Liberation War. Genocide, by definition, is the ethnic cleansing of a peoples by mass death and genocidal rape. Many of these numbers vary wildly depending on what agency is reporting them. There were between 300,000 and 3 million deaths. Between 200,000 and 400,000 women were raped. 30 million people were displaced. The war ended December 16th, 1971, with Bangladesh independence. While this was going on, Ravi Shankar, knowing that his family, friends are there, he brings this to George. And, well, Ravi, he means a lot to George. Defining their relationship is difficult. Sometimes things like friendship would almost be dismissive or trivializing.
Disciple, son.
At present we are chums because he makes me laugh more than anyone else.
So when Ravi comes to George and asks for help, it is second nature for George to spring at the opportunity to help his friends. There's a little bit of a timing dispute about when these conversations started, okay? Like I said, genocide starts 25th March, right? Klaus Vorman says that he remembers this conversations in early 1971. So I would assume what he means by that is like April 1971. Klaus says that he was there for a conversation over dinner at Friar Park. That's one. There's also a conversation that Ravi called George, or that Ravi and George met over dinner. You know what? I think it's a combination of these things because this conflict was ramping up over the course of several months. I'll get to the impetus of what really put the planning in motion, but I do believe that these conversations began in April. It's a trivial fact, but it's all over the place, so I don't want to just say one and then piss somebody off. You know. Like I said, George is back in Los Angeles. He's working on the Raga soundtrack with Ravi and doing something else that is slipping my mind and not in the script, sorry. But newspaper clippings and conversations between Ravi and George kept George abreast of the situation. The night that George arrives in Malibu, he calls his friend Chris O'Dell. Now, Chris O'Dell is an Apple employee come best friend of Patty Boyd and by proxy a very good friend of George Harrison. She, among many others, lived with the pair in Friar Park before moving to Los Angeles to be with her boyfriend at the time, Leon Russell, who also performs in the concert. Gets a little convoluted. That's why I'm giving you background. George calls and he says, "Hey, come over." And she says, "Yeah, I'm coming," but she doesn't. So a few days later, he calls again and she's like, "I'm for sure coming right now." And then she goes. George over in Malibu is wondering, like, what did I do to piss Chris off? She's really struggling with substances and what sounds like a major depressive episode, according to her memoir. And she just can't drag herself out there. She's worried about being around certain people, like the yes men that tend to hang around George when he's in Los Angeles. And she just doesn't want to deal with it. And finally, George calls again and Chris says, "Okay, I'm coming, okay?" But there weren't any of the yes men or the company that George usually keeps. It was just the two of them. And usually they might gossip or, you know, have a little bit of chit chat. But that night, George wasn't in a gossipy fun mood or spiritual mood or in a sour mood. He wanted to talk to Chris about Bangladesh. And she was shocked because she didn't know anything about this. I saw kind of over and over again that you wouldn't really know about what was going on with the Bengali people unless you were really paying attention to the news. That was one thing that George wanted to avoid, was that people would just see this like, "Oh, I guess that's still going on because it just says it's still going on." She was getting an education about this and she thought, wow, that's just awful. And then in their conversation, George stops and he's like, "I have something for you." So he goes and gets a guitar and he comes back. He says, "I'm going to make you famous." And then he starts playing for her, Miss O'Dell, while the song is asking, "Why don't you call me Miss O'Dell?" and names Chris directly. It's definitely not a love song for her. It's filled with in-jokes, witty comments about pollution and rice going missing and politicians. "Why don't you call me Miss O'Dell?" Clearly, he honestly had so much on his mind and he wanted to tell his good friend about it. Chris said that night she realized how much she missed her anchor in Patty and George when she lived with them, and that being with George was like being home. And she said, "I heard George sing Miss O'Dell many times in the years to come, but it would never sound as good as it did that night, with the waves breaking and the breeze blowing through the room, providing the only background music." And of course, it's a beautiful song. It wasn't officially recorded until October 1972 and wrapped in February 73 in Apple Studios in London and George's Studios FP Shot. He produced the song. It was a B-side to Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, released on May 7th, 1973. And the funds, the royalties from this song were assigned to the Material World Charitable Foundation, which I'll get to later for a little bit. The article. That light, free-stepping attitude you hear in Miss Odell is thrown aside abruptly when an article called Genocide by Anthony Masarenhas ran on June 13th in the Sunday Times. It's tough. It begins simply enough. Abdul Bari had run out of luck. This is a sentence everyone can understand, but the following sentiment. Like thousands of other people in East Bengal, he had made the fatal mistake, of running within sight of a Pakistani army patrol. He was 24 years old, a slight man surrounded by soldiers. He was trembling because he was about to be shot. Normally, we would have killed him as he ran. I was informed chattily by Major Rathore, the G2 Ops of the 9th Division, as we stood on the outskirts of a tiny village in these locations no longer exist, so I'm just going to skip over them. As we stood on the outskirt of a tiny village, but we are checking him out for your sake. You are new here, and I see you have a squeamish stomach. The article tells the blunt story of Anthony's encounter with the Pakistani armed forces who shot dead anyone who came within their sight, in case if he's a Hindu or a rebel or perhaps a student. The expose detailed the pogroms, the bloodshed and horror of the people of Bangladesh far too truthfully and far too well to repeat on this platform. I highly suggest you read the article. It's linked below. This article, plus that phone call from Ravi, underlined the urgency of the matter. It was no longer Miss Odell. Now it was time for Bangladesh.
Many of my relatives were there. They came as refugees, a lot of children, and all that was very painful to me. And George happened to be in Los Angeles at that time, and he saw how unhappy I was. That's nothing. I mean, let's do something big. And immediately he, like magic, and it was a magic, really.
Do it big and make $1 million. A quick review of the recent Beatles projects, all but give a blueprint for the make $1 million thing. An album, a booklet, a fever dream movie with a Boxing Day broadcast. An album, a live performance, a TV special come documentary. I mean, George even released the first box set with his triple album. The last few years had prepared him for just the thing. Of course, there would be a massive performance, details coming, with the biggest names, details coming, including some of the Beatles. They would get a top-notch producer to co-produce this live triple album box set with a booklet, and skilled videographers to capture the whole event to release as a film. It would be great. All of the proceeds would immediately go to relieve the people of Bangladesh, and Apple/Abco would absorb the cost of the concert, going in assuming that everyone involved would be willing to take cuts on their end to help the people. The live show, the album, and literally everything else that I just said was an undertaking that George bore into completely. They said overnight. But nothing could demonstrate the urgency of the moment better than George's song, Bangladesh. Bangladesh, the single. We just listened to Miss Odell. Listen to this.
My friend came to me, said the same exact.
So dramatic.
Told me that he wanted help.
The song sounds like George Harrison, not Rollover Beethoven and not My Sweet Lord, but just George Harrison to me. Very real and appropriately dramatic wail where so many people are dying fast, Bangladesh. So I just found out that like the first 40 minutes of this was filmed on accident, like vertically. So that's cool. Regarding Bangladesh, he says that I really wanted to tell people about Bangladesh and I wrote the song in about 10 minutes. I sat at the piano and that was the idea I had. That came out and I made a record of it. I didn't expect it to be a big hit, but I hoped it would be because all the money was going to the refugees. Also, that opening slow plea, my friend came to me with sadness in his eyes, that was Leon Russell's suggestion and it really does set off the tone of the song. Now, George might say that he didn't expect it to be a hit or mean for it to be a hit, but it is absolutely a hit, and I think he knew that. Bangladesh as a single has the urgency of the situation in front of us. In fact, I saw a lot of the use of the word urgent in my research regarding this song because, well, it is an urgent situation. So the crew on the song was George, Leon Russell, Jim Horn, Billy Preston, Klaus Foreman, Ringo, and Jim Keltner. So there are 7 people on that track, but it sounds like 1,000. The single art didn't shy away from the suffering, which kind of punched up the concert, which was coming literally days from this single's release. So it was released July 28, 1971. It was recorded in July in Record Plant West, Los Angeles, written by George, produced by George and Phil Spector. Let's quickly divert to the July 27 press conference. This press conference was interesting. During it, George was flanked with Alan Klein puffing away at a cigar and Ravi Shankar. They said that they were interested in answering what was going on. They wanted to bring awareness to what was going on in Bangladesh, and they wanted to help the people. They said that they expected from the show to make about $250,000, which they almost did. George said that when Ravi came to ask him for help, he said that he knew what he could do was generate money, and he wants to generate money to relieve some of the agony there. He also says that he's not interested in the politics of the situation because by his belief, any war is wrong.
There's a war, any war is wrong as far as I can see it. There's a bad situation there. All I'm trying to do is generate enough money and make sure the money is distributed in order to relieve some of the agony. That's all. I'm not interested in the politics.
Which is fine for him to claim that, but what he was doing itself was pretty radical. A lot of Western publications at this point weren't even calling it Bangladesh. They were still calling it East Pakistan. It wasn't an entity. Calling it Bangladesh by itself was a call for nation building. It was a call for independence. George did get more political about this later on in his life. He called them Pakistani Hitlers. And there were other conversations, I believe, for the 1995 CD release that he did mention this.
At that stage, Pakistan was having a war with Bengal, and that these people were getting killed and wiped out, and there was a lot of countries was supporting Pakistan with armaments and stuff like that. So it really was to bring world attention to the fact that the Bengalis were being treated very poorly.
Back to the press conference. So they asked George why he chose to do all this, and he said that it's because his friend asked him to. That's all. But of course it took very little time before they started asking George about the Beatles, and George gets mad. And he's like, he doesn't entertain the chatter very long.
Well, should we talk about the concert? Really, this concert is here, I mean, the whole idea of it is to try and help some people. And we're not here really to talk about the Beatles,
Fight as he may from his Beatle history, I understand. But there is one thing that he hasn't done without the other three. The fearful frontman. He's not the quiet Beatle. Not by any stretch, honestly. He's certainly not shy, but he's definitely not the frontman. He wanted some backing, some solid performers and friends to fortify one of the world's foremost and most talented musicians of all time. We're all human. He was nervous. I get it. I would be remiss if I didn't say that George didn't want this to be the George Harrison show. He also didn't want it to be a Beatles reunion. So I want to say that insecurity was not the only driver of his choice to load the stage. But I'd be double remiss if I didn't add in the bits from Get Back, because I always do, of where the boys, especially George and John, were talking about a fifth Beatle or some more collaborative spirit.
I mean, I'd just like him in our band, actually. I like a fifth Beatles.
I asked Dylan to join the Beatles, and he would as well, and we get them all in it.
So George dives in. And by the way, George is a woo-woo girl. We love him for it, not a judgment. So he goes to see a spiritual advisor to help plan the event. The advisor says that the best days are the first 2 days of August, and it turns out that the 1st of August is the only day that Madison Square Garden has available, and George wants to sell it out. So an interesting tidbit. This is directly from Wikipedia, but I do have a quote as well. Stephen Stills, having proceeded to sell out Madison Square Garden 2 days before the concert on 30th July in support of his album Stephen Stills 2, allowed Harrison to use his stage, sound, lighting system, and production manager, but was upset when Harrison neglected to invite him to perform, mention his name, or say thank you. Stills then spent the show drunk in Ringo Starr's dressing room, barking at everyone. Here's from a book that I read. This is what Stephen Stills said. But Bangladesh happened 3 days later, and all of New York critics were living in George Harrison's hallway. My show didn't even get reviewed. And when I donated my stage, sound, and lighting system and my production manager to George, he didn't just not invite me to play. He didn't mention my name. I never got a thank you note. I got so upset. I went to Ringo's room, got real drunk, and just sat there barking at everybody. Those assholes. My feelings were just real hurt, and I wanted to make everybody else as miserable as I was. And that is from Dave Zimmer's Crosby, Stills, and Nash book. So back to the collaborative spirit. What a left turn. George really was spending like all night and day trying to get some of these people here. Everyone who is a friend of George Harrison loves him, and the friendships of George Harrison, I mean, that's fascinating in its own. It is its own video, honestly.
I really appreciate it in later days that he actually went in front of that audience on the Bangladesh concert because he did it for his friends. That he actually went up there and talked to an audience. I think it must have been about the first time he's ever done this. To talk to an audience, very, very difficult for him.
Combined with it being such a good cause and it being George, some of the world's biggest names were happy to jump on. So Ringo, of course, says yes. Billy Preston, you didn't even have to ask. Klaus Voormann is in. Jim Keltner's in. Badfinger's in. Jim Horn, all of them are in. Those are the obvious gets. So Paul was not there, obviously. There are a few different reasons / lines for Paul's absence, and I think all of them are true. According to this, Paul said that if the others dissolve their relationship as the Beatles, then he would perform, or if they drop the countersuit, that he would play the concert. That I've only seen 2 different places, and I haven't heard that from John or George, who were pretty outspoken around this time, so I think we would have heard it elsewhere. Other reasons include Paul just not wanting to have the buzz around a possible Beatles reunion, the tensions of their relationships being too difficult to navigate for a benefit concert, and finally, it was legally a bad look. So he's not there. This is an actual quote from Paul. He says, "I didn't play on George's Bangladesh concert because if I'd turned up and John had turned up, then the headlines around the world would have screamed, the Beatles are together again. Quite frankly, I didn't fancy playing there anyway." John. Now, I really am doing my best here to not just read walls of text for this video. There's just a lot with John, okay? Now, there's been the lines about not wanting a Beatles reunion, another time that he said he just didn't feel like it, and in the 1980 Playboy interview, he said a lot of stuff, so let's focus on that. John says that he didn't want to have anything to do with benefits. He has been benefited to death, and they ask why, and he says, because they're always rip-offs. I haven't performed for personal gain since 1966 when the Beatles last performed. Every concert since then, Yoko and I did for specific charities except for a Toronto thing that was a rock and roll revival. Every one of them was a mess or a ripoff. So now we give money to who we want. You've heard of tithing? I'm just going to do it privately. I'm not going to get locked into the business of saving the world on stage. The show is always a mess and the artist always comes off badly. Bangladesh was caca. By the way, I've combined some of the comments in quotes a little bit. Of course, sources linked below. So they say, you mean because of all the questions that were raised about where the Bangladesh money went? And he said, yeah, right. I can't even talk about it because it's still a problem. You'll have to check with Mother, Yoko, because she knows the ins and outs of it. I don't, but it's all a ripoff. So forget about it. All of you who are reading this, don't bother sending me all that garbage about just come and save the Indians, come and save the blacks, come and save the war veterans. Anybody I want to save will be helped through our tithing, which is 10% of whatever we earn. Journalist Robert Barry said that he was invited by them, John and Yoko, to come see the Bangladesh concert, and he checked into his room and pretty much immediately got a call from Yoko. Yoko said that there was a huge problem and that she and John had gotten in a huge fight and that he'd already taken off back to London. Now, this isn't particularly related to this whole story at all, but this journalist was asked to stay behind to look after Yoko's sister, Setsuko, for the weekend, and they dressed as John and Yoko for the weekend and caused a stir. Fun. When I got back to London, I telephoned the Lennons to thank them for their kindness, and John wanted to know every detail of what had happened. He was very amused by my excitement. So what do you think of being a Beatle then? He asked. I replied, I had enjoyed it so much that I am now considering taking it up professionally. John replied, I wouldn't think about that if I were you. It takes talent to be a Beatle, you know. Damn. But this same story has been expanded upon elsewhere. Essentially, John wanted Yoko to play on stage and George said no. John fought for Yoko a little bit, but essentially it pissed Yoko off enough that John got in a big fight, heard rumors as to whether or not he crushed his glasses, got on the flight to London so quickly that he left his clothes behind. Eric Clapton. George's relationship with Eric Clapton was complicated enough with or without a hastily planned benefit concert. Or it should have been. It's well known that Eric Clapton was in love with Pattie Boyd, George's wife, and later to be Eric's wife as well. It's also well known that while there were dalliances, affairs / whatever, George was also constantly cheating. No one was off limits except actually Chris O'Dell. And it might seem like it's off topic, but it's not, because 18 months prior, Eric and Patty had kind of a climactic moment in their relationship. Eric makes her choose between him and George and threatens, if you don't choose me, I'm going to start using drug full time. And she says, well, I'm going with George. So Eric leaves and he goes off and starts using heroin full time, and she doesn't see him for 18 months. When George started planning the event, Eric Clapton came up almost immediately. He wanted Eric to play. He brought it up in every conversation. And of course, there would be the obstacle of Eric's overwhelming addiction issue and whether or not he could make it through a plane ride without going through withdrawal. This made his presence pretty unreliable, but one of the things that is in Eric's self-imposed exile at Heartwood Edge, one of the people that he would still open the doors to was George Harrison. So there was that hope that Eric might show up. Up until the week of rehearsals, no one really knew. Okay, spoiler, Eric does show up, okay? I just want to take this moment to tell an anecdote that showed up across the board. In order to get Eric Clapton to New York City, he would need enough supply. He can't travel with it, and he would need enough to get him through a couple of performances without getting sick, just enough to get him onto a plane back to Heathrow. Now, he'd sent out his girlfriend, Alice, to go find the right stuff, and it had to be very strong because he snorted it from a gold spoon around his neck. Patty wrote in her book, she, Alice, always did the scoring as she did everything Eric wanted. At Heartwood Edge, she went to London to do the sordid business of getting supplies while Eric stayed at home. If they ever ran short, she would give him her share and take something else. She was drinking at least 2 bottles of vodka a day so he could have the heroin, yet he would accuse her of doing the reverse. Well, they couldn't find it, not the kind that Eric needed, so he's spending a couple of days in his hotel room, sick as a dog, until they finally get some methadone, which is enough to prop him up for those 2 shows. Patty said that she was shocked to see Eric's condition and upsetting to think that he'd done this to himself because of her. And then she would feel angry at him for putting her in that horrible position to begin with. And by the way, that is a place where she could not win. He made it so she would lose either way. She says, when the concert was over, Eric and Alice went back to the horrors of their self-imposed prison at Heartwood Edge and took up where they had left off. Once again, they closed the door on their friends and the world and left the phones to ring unanswered. Bob Dylan. Of all of those who were unpredictable and whether or not they'd show up, Bob Dylan was the worst. George really wanted Bob there. They're close friends and gleaned lots of inspiration from each other musically. However, Bob was famously reclusive and incredibly nervous on stage. His last time playing in public was performing at the Isle of Wight in 1969, which I understand to have been a disaster, but honestly, I just didn't have time to look into it, so all I just saw was that it was bad. So I guess it was bad. A combination of all of these things made his status as performer pretty sketchy. Because of both Eric's and Bob's shaky willingness to participate, George and Klaus auditioned / prepared a couple of backup musicians in case they didn't show up, which included Jesse Ed Davis and Peter Frampton. Everyone said that whether or not Bob showed up was going to be a surprise, and the only person who predicted with confidence that he would be there was Al Aronowitz, the man who introduced Bob Dylan to the Beatles to begin with. This is what Chris O'Dell said about it. So we were all at the rehearsal on edge, waiting to see if Dylan would show up. Patty and I spent a few minutes talking to Al Aronowitz, the music columnist for the New York Post and the man who first introduced the Beatles to Bob Dylan back in 1964. He was standing by the side of the stage, watching the goings-on when we joined him. Do you think Bob will show up? Patty asks, obviously worried about the possibility he might not. Sure he will, Al said with great confidence. Bob wouldn't let George down. The concert for Bangladesh and all that comes with it. This is regularly spoken about as like the first benefit concert. And then I read in one of the I read so many books, okay, I'm sorry. But like regarding this, somebody was like, it's not the first benefit concert. So then I looked up benefit concerts and it was like the first benefit concert done like this, because there would be benefit events, just like a group of people together to raise some money. I have a screenshot, so I'll throw up some information about them. So technically it's like the first benefit concert, like the benefit rock concert, the Live Aid, the rock against racism or whatever that's called. Oh my God. It's like the first of those things, I guess, but to call it like the first benefit concert ever would be inaccurate. So they're traveling to New York City and there's kind of this crazy story about a really rough flight. It's such a bizarre quote and similar to a story that Peter Sellers told, so I want to read it. George says, I almost didn't make it. My plane got caught in a violent thunderstorm and was struck 3 times by lightning. We started bouncing around, dropping hundreds of feet all the time, and the lights went out. There were explosions and everybody was terrified. A Boeing 707 went over the top of us, missing us by inches. I thought that the back end of the plane had been blown off. I ended up with my feet pressed against the seat in front, my seatbelt as tight as could be, yelling Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Hare at the top of my voice. Damn. As far as rehearsals go, Klaus said that it was mostly like a jam session, lots of George Harrison songs, some Beatles songs. Some people didn't know them, but most of them did. Now, the boys in Badfinger worked really hard to learn the songs, and Klaus said that the attitude was really positive throughout the entire time. Ravi said that because everyone was there for such a good thing, trying to help people, and they were donating their time, it seemed like everyone had kind of a spirit of goodwill. They spent the week working rather diligently with good vibes and hard work ethic, very George. Instead of burgers and beer, they have Indian food. And there were some planned stand-ins for Eric and Bob, but Eric pulls through and Dylan pulls through at rehearsal. And George is like, okay, well, you're here at rehearsal, so that means you're here. Dylan is still like, even though he's made it to rehearsal, he's like, I don't know, man. And he says, hey, man, this isn't my scene. I can't make this. And George goes, this isn't my scene either. I don't want to hear that. This is the first time I've ever done anything on my own. You have been a solo artist for years. And he's like, I've got to get back to Long Island. And then Dylan just leaves. Everybody said that they were like holding on to hope that he would come. Phil Spector claims that he dragged Dylan there.
Dylan was a no-show up until the last minute. I had to go down to his apartment and literally get him. It was chaos.
I don't know, okay? I didn't look into it, okay? He wasn't really expecting Bob to actually show up, but he says he was walking right on stage. It was like now or never, so I had to say, I'd like to bring on a friend of us all, Mr. Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan showed up as a surprise, at least to the audience, and all. Well, let's just
take. It's a surprise to me too.
Was it really a surprise?
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's just go through the official roster. As far as the Indian music go, we have Ravi Shankar on sitar, Ali Akbar Khan on sarod, Alaraka on tabla, and Kamala Chakravarti on tambura. And as far as our rockers go, we have George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Leon Russell, Klaus Voormann, Jim Keltner, Badfingers, Pete Ham, Tom Evans, and Joey Moland, and accompanying Leon Russell, Don Preston, and Carl Radle. I'm missing somebody. Mike Gibbons. It was Mike Gibbons. And accompanying Leon Russell were Don Preston and Carl Radle. As far as the brass section goes, we have Jim Horn, Chuck Finley, Jackie Kelso, Alan Butler, Lou McCreary, and Ollie Mitchell. And for the Don Nix choir, there's Claudia Linear, Joe Green, Jeannie Green, Marlon Green, Dolores Hall, Don Nix himself, and Don Preston. They had initially just planned the one show. George was he lacked confidence in his ability to sell out. He knew the Beatles could, but he didn't know quite so much about himself. But they quickly had to add 2 shows. I read that the tickets originally sold for $4. I read over and over again that people were scalping for $41. And I read in one book that they were scalping for $1,000. I mean, I saw it in one book, okay? So I would hold that to a big amount of salt. George was saying that they decided to put in an extra concert in the evening. They sold out the seats at the back of the stage. They sold out overnight. It was really chaotic. Of course, the police were involved because it was kind of highly anticipated. A lot of people were still kind of hoping for a Beatles reunion. Even though people tried to quash the rumors, the speculation would never stop. And George tried to discourage that with naming the show George Harrison and Friends rather than naming off George Harrison, Ringo Starr, blah, blah, blah. The setup was left over from the Stills show, and there were a lot of issues with miking the audience, recording the audience, overdubbing the audience. I'll get there later on. Phil Spector is kind of an unreliable narrator, and I'll get there in a minute as well, but he was not quite all there at this point, or in general. He said that they only had 3 hours to mic the band, which may be true, but he said that it took 6 months to mix the album, which would mean that the album was finished mixing 2 months after it was released. So the story does get a little bizarre in a minute, okay? Like it's gonna get really confusing, and there will be caveats, trust me, and they'll be addressed as quickly as I can. George Harrison and Friends. Here are our stats, okay? 2 shows, 2:30 and 8 p.m. on Sunday, August 1st, 1971 at Madison Square Garden. 40,000 attendees, roughly 20,000 per show. 200 people broke in during the evening show. The gates raised $243,418.50, and and you're going to hear that number a lot. Apologies. And that money was administered to UNICEF on August 12th. As far as the show itself goes, it begins with George coming out all by himself and introducing the show, explaining that the concert will start with a performance by Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar and Sarad, Ala Raka on tabla, and asks everyone to give it a good shot. Be patient with it. From Graham Thompson's book, he says, Harrison wanted the musical content to reflect in some way on the cause. The subtext made clear that this was not a poor relation coming to America with its begging bowl, but rather a culturally rich region being torn to shreds. Now, the audience did politely entertain them. They clapped at the actual tuning of the instruments, and Ravi had this funny little quip.
Thank you. If you appreciate the tuning so much, I hope you'll enjoy the playing more. Thank you.
But when I was watching, I was just so captivated by the chemistry on stage. The chemistry between Ravi and Ali Akbar Khan is just, I mean, it's magnetic. Look at them. They're like one-upping each other and they're into it and they're going after it. And it's just something that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting to feel so like pumped up from listening to this music of like peace. It was really interesting and really, really beautiful. I found myself being really moved by it. Before the show gets rocking in earnest, they stop and have an intermission that includes a graphic Dutch film telling the reality of the plight in Bangladesh. George said they had a good film showing exactly what was happening and they wouldn't let us have it for some political reasons. So we had to try and find a film because I didn't want the audience to be a crazy rock and roll audience. I wanted them to realize what it was all about. So I showed them this film and it really brought the audience down. And then we came on and did the rock and roll. It was obviously a very successful show. At the time when I was putting it together, I had no idea about how it was going to turn out. We were fortunate that it turned out well, but at the same time, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. I had a vague idea, but it was all so much bigger than I thought. There were a few moments of this concert that were so noteworthy that they're repeated across each account. Many of them that were so profound that they'll be repeated here. And one of these astounding moments was the quiet Beatles walk upon the stage, was followed with a 10-minute standing ovation. Everyone was so happy to see George. He just stood there. And it was emotional just to look at him smiling for a moment. But there he is in his white suit and his red shirt. And he comes out and he plays Wah Wah. And his vocals are a little off, right? But it is rousing. And I'm absolutely blown away. It is so fun. And it is, wow, a totally different switch in energy from the Indian music we just heard. Then George plays and then George plays Awaiting on You All. Billy Preston comes out and plays That's the Way God Planned It. Wow.
Why can't we be humble like the good Lord said?
I've always really enjoyed Billy Preston's work. He's so talented and so much fun, brings such a light in Get Back. I have an obsession with Get Back. You can maybe tell a little bit. The Get Back, Let It Be, Nagger Tapes, all of that. Okay, anyway. You need to clarify because you're special. You think you're so smart and so cool. You know everything about you, everything. You're so fucking cool. I love Billy Preston. The way he got on, started singing, he was such a natural in front of a sold out Madison Square Garden. Dude, the Beatles had never done Madison Square Garden, and there's Billy Preston, little Billy Preston, not little, but like he comes out and he just really rocks it. And he gets up and he dances and it is so fun. It really brings the whole house down. I mean, wow. I was not expecting, I read that he had danced. I had read about it before I watched it. I don't know, that's the way things went down. I don't know what I expected the dance to be. It wasn't that. I was just happy. Then Ringo plays It Don't Come Easy. In one of the books I read, I think it was Alan Clayson's book, he mentions that Leon Russell performs for longer than Billy and Ringo combined. And that was a good point. No offense to Leon Russell, but what the hell? We only hear one song from Ringo. Fine, if you don't want to play Beatles music, right? But you couldn't throw us a Boys or a Honey Don't. Some covers that we recognize from Ringo. It was not his best work. I love Ringo, by the way. Like, I don't really have a favorite Beatle, but I would say that he gets preferential treatment here because I feel like he's been shit on for so long that somebody has to pay attention to the guy. The drum's always great, right? He's fine. It's just, it feels wrong. Okay, yeah, I guess Ringo played. You know what I mean? It was just so lackluster. Maybe it's Ringo playing with another drummer next to him. I don't know what it is. I just didn't like it. And that is coming from like huge Ringo fan. Huge Ringo fan. And here's what's funny is that in my script I wrote so much fun, just talk. And that was apparently my feelings when I wrote it, but I think I'm feeling a little bit more honest. Now, then there's Beware of Darkness with George and Leon Russell. Not what I was expecting and not a song that I would have picked. I thought it was a really good performance. Then, of course, there's While My Guitar Gently Weeps with George and Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton said that he thought he performed horribly. He was like, I fucking sucked. I don't know what it was. There's always a lot of conversations about the dueling guitars. I don't know, like, I really liked Beware of Darkness. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, I don't know, Eric Clapton said that he thought he played horribly. I thought he played fine. This performance, similar to the Don't Come Easy, it just didn't hit for me. It just didn't hit for me. I think I liked it the first time I listened to it. Here's my memory a week later that it wasn't my favorite. Leon Russell, who I really know very little about, comes on and plays Jumpin' Jack Flash and Young Blood, and I really like Young Blood. But in my opinion, the best part of Young Blood was when George goes, well, look at that. And that's because George sings the main of Youngblood in the Beatles, and I wish that he would have been the one singing Youngblood. Maybe I'm a little biased. Maybe I like the Beatles. I don't know. As far as this medley goes, whether you love it or you hate it, depends on who you talk to. It seems like it's kind of divisive, but I thought it was fun. I just wish it was the Beatles, I think. George's Here Comes the Sun really broke me down emotionally. Are you surprised?
Little darling, it seems like years since it's been clear.
I'm not even particularly attached to this song. I just had an emotional breakdown because why wouldn't I? Obviously, the Beatles songs did hit me harder during this, and I made sure to showcase it for you because if you're a crybaby back bitch, why not make fun of yourself for it on the internet? Most interesting thing about me.
It's alright.
When George introduces everyone, it's almost like it's an afterthought the way that he mentions Eric Clapton. He says, my friend Eric Clapton. Maybe that's what Eric wanted, you know, like hiding in the background with his golden spoon around his neck, hoping for a drug that he wasn't going to be able to find in these streets. Propped up. He was still there. And then, of course, there is a friend of us all, Bob Dylan. George had Bob ? Written on cellophane on his guitar. He said that he didn't know if Dylan would be there until he showed up himself. He actually said this in a really cute way I think it was either on the Dick Cavett show or maybe one of the later interviews. George said that the newspaper advertisements would never say that Bob was coming because he never comes on, he never comes up, and he goes, he sits at home and reads it in the paper and then he doesn't want to come. So that's why he decided to do George Harrison and Friends. And he said that not actually naming the stars just made everybody a bonus. George said Bob came because, first of all, he knew that it had sold out anyway and he decided he'd like to do this to help a good thing. It was only the night before the concert that we knew he was going to be on the show, but even then it was touch and go. He could have gone home again.
It's a hard rain gonna fall.
Then Bob goes and plays A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, It Takes a Lot to Laugh, Blowin' in the Wind, and then for the first performance he played Love Minus Zero and No Limit, and then in the second performance he scrapped that and played Mr. Tambourine Man, and then played Just Like a Woman. Now Chris O'Dell's memoir, she really wrote it very well. But Bob Dylan hushed the crowd like a preacher mesmerizing his congregation, half singing, half speaking his stories about stumbling along on the misty mountains and crawling on crooked highways, and a hard rain's gonna fall, ending his 5-song set with Just Like a Woman, and my favorite line of any Dylan song, but you break just like a little girl. Something about Bob Dylan's voice had changed. His voice was deeper, more soulful, as if he were reaching deeper and singing from his heart rather than his head. And then George plays. I cried. I was really touched. I just want to read this one review. This is from the British show business correspondent Patrick Doncaster. He said, I stood backstage in the Madison Square Garden as George triumphantly led world pop names in one big exciting group sound. My sweet Lord, he sang, and the vast arena thrilled to this great hit that preaches Krishna. Hare Krishna, he chanted into the mic before going into the vocal. And you know he had found something close to happiness. Now, Al Aronowitz, who I mentioned before of the New York Post, said, the overwhelming spectacle of George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Bob Dylan, and Leon Russell performing together on the same stage may not be something you expect to read about in college textbooks someday, but that's what happened at Madison Square Garden last Sunday, and is as much of an event in the history of our times as anything music has to offer. We've got to talk about the album and everything that came with it, but before we do that, we've got to talk about the thing about Phil. Okay, so the problem about working with Phil Spector is that you have to work with Phil Spector. He was impossible to nail down in the studio at this point. He was strung out on like 1,800 types of substances, especially alcohol, and unable to sit still, in and out of the hospital. And the wall of sound was great, but so was George Harrison. His production was good enough without Phil, and he did a lot of work without him. Phil Spector got the credit, but he's hard to pin down, so mentions of him are less than favorable. And I was going to go through all of them point by point, but I guess I'll go over the positive things that have been said before. George mentions on the Dick Cavett show that he and Phil spent a month in the studio mixing the album, and he co-produced Bangladesh, the single. Okay, and then on to the other stuff that's been said about it. He was flaky pre-show due to the alcoholism. He was not involved in mic/setup recordings. Someone else did it. And he was dancing during the actual concert. That's what George said. He was barely involved afterward. He said that it took about 6 months to mix the album. As I said before, that doesn't work. There was this thing that was said in the Peter Doggett book, but I'm going to tell you about that later because it is a fun story for us all. So that's just Phil. But if we have to deal with the thing about Phil, we need to deal with the thing about the mix/recording. Now, Simon Lang, a biographer, said it's the worst live recording of all time, behind maybe the Hollywood Bowl. So, ouch. The two performances were recorded on Record Planet's 16-track mobile unit, and the mixing began there the day after the show. Spector was suffering from alcohol problems and was in and out of the hospital, so George took on a lot. Miking up so many people on stage was tough, and some overdubbing was done on Leon Russell's medley and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, while Wah Wah was a combination of the two takes from both shows. After a little over a week at Record Plant or Record Planet, final mixes were done at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles in September. Real quickly, I wanted to mention that George gave everybody veto power. He didn't want anybody to have their name associated to something that they didn't like. No one took the veto power, but Leon Russell insisted on some of the overdubbing. So he was the only one that was like, we have to fix this. Let me lay it out just very plainly first so y'all can at least know what all the fuss is about before we get in. Things are going to get weird. So this is the Concert for Bangladesh box set. Okay, it was recorded August 1st, 1971, released 20th December 1971. It was produced by George Harrison and Phil Spector. Runtime, 99 minutes, 32 seconds. Triple album, obviously, orange box set, 64-page color booklet with photos from soundcheck and concert, and the album art is a still from a photo shoot with some airbrushing on it. And the concert executives were trying to go with the back cover photo, which is just, it's dorky. It's got a guitar case filled with food and medical supplies and a copy of the check for the box office takings. It's very Look, we did it. George wrote a letter to Patty when this was going down, and he said, the original proof of the guitar was awful, so I had to jump on that and change it and shout at them, and now it will be okay with the original idea of the kid. It's such a pain, all that messing around just because they didn't like the truth. Man, he's not afraid. In a reminder, and this will be brought up again, but the album retailed for $12.98 in the US and £5.50 in the UK. I'm probably saying that incorrectly. I'm so sorry. I don't know currencies. The album was successful. It spent 6 weeks at Billboard's charts #2 in the US and sold certified gold on January 4th, 1972. And they won a Grammy in March 1973 for Album of the Year. Ringo carried a tray of Grammys off the stage, one for each of the featured performers. As far as the film goes, there were like a shit ton of issues with filming, by the way. I mean, as if any of this could go smoothly, for real. So let's begin with the camera issue, okay? There were like 4 cameras. One camera straight in the back was so poorly lit that the light was like just a little speck in the middle. So that camera was out. One camera in the left was obscured by huge cables in front of it. So they had the camera in the pit right in front of the stage and then another handheld right in front of the stage. So those last 2 cameras were basically all we got. Now, they converted the film, which was shot on 16mm to 70mm, which was a pain in the ass, and audio syncing the video was a torturous process, according to Saul Swimmer, the director of the video. And reportedly, 80% of the concert was redubbed. George says that there were 12 cuts with the wah-wah performance alone. Dylan did come in for some of the editing process. That blurriness of the footage with him on it was on purpose. He wanted it that way, according to George. There were even issues with like lighting and production the day of. So the first performance, I think Jim Keltner said this, the first performance, the lights were bright white and everybody was like sweating. It was so hot and it was like impossible to perform. And they brought it up to the people and they were like, ha ha ha. And they lit them all color the second time, but they had like the good lighting the first time. I don't know. I'll have to find the quote and put it up top. John Lennon was there. He did say something really positive. He said, Bangladesh is the most fantastic thing. They're blowing the film up to 70mm and it's going to earn millions for those people. It's fantastic. And George is virtually an ambassador in the world. He's going to go to India and Bangladesh and see where the money's going to go and, you know, following it through. He's taken on a great responsibility and he's doing it because he's on his own and he's found something he wants to do. I think it's fantastic. He never got to go to Bangladesh, by the way. Here are some of the numbers. 23rd March 1972 for US, 27th July 1972 for UK. The box office grossed $2.5 million in US, Canada, and the reviews were mixed. Some people said it was great, some people couldn't get over the weird mixing. Some people said it was great, it was moving, and some people said it was just there's no way you were gonna recapture the music magic of the night. And no matter what numbers we get into, I had all these numbers all sorted out. Everything was so nice and neat and we were all going to be able to understand that. But unfortunately, I have to interrupt that this time. And that's because
I'm a con man who's on all sides for the change. All those other con men are on the other side.
the crux.
I don't know if he speaks to you the same way as he does other people. He'll ask you a question and you're halfway through answering it, and if he doesn't like the answer, or if it's not really what he wanted to hear, he'll change the subject right in the middle of a sentence.
Oh, come on, you know I had to do it, but seriously. Premonition much? Cough drop alert. I think it might be best to go semi-chronologically, just try to keep up, I don't know. So before the show, George had declared that all the proceeds would be going to charity. Because of legal stuff I'm not getting into, there was a receiver appointed to Beatles business. And he gets a hold of George and says, hey, in order to do this, you need all the Beatles to sign off for you to do this free stuff. Now, all the Beatles approve. It did take Paul 5 weeks to approve it. Now that was mentioned. But also during this communication, the receiver says to George, hey, by the way, you're doing this. Well, the government might plan on taxing this as your income, even if you give it to charity. And George is like, Alan Klein's got me. It's okay. 1st of August, they have their show. They raise, once again, $243,418.50. And that goes to UNICEF on August 12th. In between the 1st and the 12th, George had kind of shuffled through deciding what foundation they were going to go through. They were concerned about Red Cross. He aired them out on Dick Cavett oh my God, Dick Cavett, you poor man, he just popped off on your show. They went through Red Cross and a couple others, but ultimately decided with UNICEF. And they were also mixing the album, but none of that matters. So this is all pretty much immediately, okay? So the head of Capitol, Basker Menon, goes to Alan Klein and says, yeah, sure, we'll take some cuts because of this charity thing, but we still want money. We want $500,000. And Klein's like,
I'm sorry, what's up?
Basker eventually relented. Okay, this was the whole thing. It took a minute. We'll get there. But I'm just going to tell you exactly what happened with Columbia right now. Dylan's company, Columbia, was mad because they wanted distribution rights. And they were given hefty distribution rights and 25 cents on the album. It is the only company to make money from this at all. So on September, good time for Alan Klein, Rolling Stone files a lawsuit against him. They're still mixing the album, and the IRS starts looking, hey, what's the deal with this charity situation? It turns out that Alan Klein didn't register this event as a charity event before they did it, which is what that receiver predicted. Not just in the UK, but also in the US. This was gonna be taxed. And the IRS didn't like this. They didn't like that he didn't pick UNICEF beforehand. They didn't like that UNICEF wasn't involved in the event. It didn't work out. The IRS held on to that money in an escrow account for 10 years. Before that, they were able... Hey. Okay. If you hear a clicking sound, that's my cat eating. Before they go into the escrow account, $2 million in December 1971 were given to refugees. Alan Klein is still going up against Basker Menon trying to figure out that situation. And meanwhile, George is realizing that the UK purchase tax is going to be massive and it's going to continue to drive the price of this album up. And he didn't want it to be this expensive. So he goes and meets with England's chief financial undersecretary, Patrick Jenkins. And reportedly, he says, of course, we are genuinely sympathetic, Mr. Harrison. However, have you heard the saying, charity begins at home, Mr. Harrison? And George reportedly said back, perhaps you people would prefer it if I were to move out of England, like virtually every other major British pop star, and take my money with me? And then he says, that of course would be entirely up to you.
What's the biggest charity in the world? I don't mean in terms of like polio, but what's the most charitable thing anybody could do?
They say, don't they say, charity begins at home. So we're doing it at George's house.
The purchase tax stays and they tax George. George writes the Crown a check for $1 million. He just eats it. We're creeping into October and negotiations are still going on slowly. And while things are maybe coming along with Columbia, the wholesalers, the other distributors are causing issues. We'll get there in a second. Bootleggers are ripping versions of the performance and selling it everywhere to the point that George has to put out ads saying, don't buy bootlegs, please help the starving children. On 23rd of November, George goes on Dick Cavett. And George says a lot of stuff when he's on the show. He's actually promoting Raga, the documentary that I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this video. And the interview is actually legendary among Beatles fans and probably a lot of people in general because he stands up as a joke when Dick Cavett's like, hey, Yoko sat in here like last week, and he's like, pfft.
Yoko sat in that very chair.
He also deadpans a promotion for John and Yoko's Christmas album, and he pokes fun at all the advertisements. It's fun. He calls US television rubbish, and he says a lot of stuff about what's going on with the album, the box set. He says if the album gets out when he hopes it will, that they will have made a good amount by February, and he's hoping to go to Bangladesh himself to personally deliver the money. This unfortunately never got to happen, and George was never able to visit, but Ravi did and said that the love there for both him and George is palpable. He tells Dick that the album is already mixed and that Apple/Abco has covered all the cost up to $100,000 of the concert, the album, the distribution, everything. And he says that Basker Menon, head of Capitol, wanted $500,000 for recognition for putting out the album. He says that he's holding everything up. And he says that Basker, who is Indian, was initially pumped about the idea, but then eventually cared more about the almighty dollar. Pound? The money. He cared about the money. George calls Basker a bastard and says that he will go to Columbia and have CBS distribute the album with Dylan, and he says, sue me, Basker.
You'll get it out, though.
We'll get it out. I mean, I'll just put it out, put it out with CBS and let, Basker have to sue me. Basker Menon.
And then Basker rebuts, saying that George doesn't have all the facts, and when George does find out the facts, he calls Basker the next day to apologize. In December, Capitol finally sends Apple $3.75 million check for advance sales, and the album releases on December 20th. Like I mentioned, in December, $2 million go to refugees via UNICEF, and in 1981, after the escrow account is released, $8.8 million go to UNICEF. The article redux. The 28th of February, 1972, some sour notes from the Bangladesh concert by Peter McCabe was published in New York Magazine. Now, it took some looking, as in your mother's favorite search engine, to find this article, and I mean, it was very interesting. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to be reading a good chunk of it. The link, of course, will be below. Now, this is one source, one journalist. There was some dispute, there's some pushback. I'll be reading that, okay? So keep that in mind. But ultimately, this meant, if this reporting was correct, that about $6 million of the projected sales would be missing. Listen, here's the deal. I don't like how I did this part. I'm gonna do my best to divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived this, but there is still quite a bit of quoting from these articles, from both the Peter McCabe article and then the rebuttal, it's not really a rebuttal, from Rolling Stones, or a context article afterward. Sit tight. I'm gonna do my best to make this a little bit more understandable and digestible, but it's so interesting that I can't leave it out. I don't know if anybody is still watching this. If you're still watching this, you're cool. You're fucking cool. Okay. So there's going to be a lot of numbers. This article comes straight for Alan Klein, giving good faith to, honestly, where it belongs with Ravi and George and the other performers. McCabe speculates that the amount of money that could be raised, saying that if sales projections go the way that they're saying, $45 million could go to refugees. That is not what happened. Now, McCabe says, don't be fooled. This was George and Ravi's thing, but it's Klein's baby too. And this could rebuild his reputation after losing Paul and this lawsuit with Rolling Stone. Everybody needs to make Klein look good. The article says, the upcoming concert provided Klein with an opportunity to make Paul look small. Paul had said that he would accept George's invitation to appear at the Bangladesh concert, Klein told reporters, but only if the other three Beatles agreed to dissolve the partnership. It continues on later. He went on to great lengths to stress the philanthropic motives for presenting the Bangladesh concert, but Klein was also planning another concert soon afterwards, a benefit for Shelter, an English charity organization, to take place at Wembley Stadium in England during the fall of 1971. Wembley, Klein declared during an interview last summer. George will announce he's going to do a concert, right? About 2 weeks before, Ringo will say, hey, I'll play too. Then John says he's going to be there. Everyone will want to know where Paul is. He'll think I'm trying to embarrass him. You betcha. I'll roast his fucking ass. So not exactly philanthropic reasons to have a concert. McCabe brings up the delay of the album and what could be causing that. And then he talks about Capitol Records. Capitol Records' distribution agreement was signed in 1969 with a huge bump in royalties for the Beatles. And Capitol was willing to reduce its share in proceeds because of the charity of it all. You don't want to be the dick during the charity album. So now at this point, only the price needs to be agreed upon. And Brown Meggs, he's going to come up, so pay attention. Capitol's marketing vice president said that there were other ongoing negotiations with Klein and Capitol. And he says, and Mr. Klein hadn't failed to mention these during his talks about the Bangladesh album. McCabe goes on to say, but if all the money from the concert was going to charity, why was Klein laboring so hard over the Bangladesh album? So McCabe says that Klein is using the concert album as a wedge to drive home other details with Capitol, quoting Meggs sort of vaguely about it, saying, oh, I don't know. Yeah. But later, Basker, Menon, and Klein both deny this or knowledge of this. Now, Brown Meggs proceeded to shed a little more light on the company's protracted negotiations with Alan Klein. This is all in dollars because this is all American shit. Album retails for $12.98. $2.98 is the retailer's margin. Then we've got $10 even. $5 goes to the refugees. Capitol gets $2.73 of that. 86.5 cents go to production, $1.86 to distribution / overheads, 25 cents to Columbia for a use royalty for Dylan's services, of which he gets none, and that leaves $2.27. This is from the article. That would mean, presumably, that the entire amount accruing to Columbia, which will be richer by $750,000 if 3 million copies of the albums are sold. Record companies naturally don't like their hottest artists appearing on other labels, but a performer of Bob Dylan's stature has considerable leverage, possibly enough to persuade Columbia to donate Dylan's services freely for so worthy a cause as Bangladesh, especially as Dylan's contract comes up for renewal shortly. Now, because of this tight margin, Capitol decides to do this weird ass thing. They go to their dealers and say, okay, instead of 100% reimbursement for returns, we're only doing 10%. And this stresses out the dealers a little bit because holy shit, what if it doesn't do well? We had to take this step because we were literally just covering our costs and overhead, said Meggs. Klein and his people are difficult to deal with and we have to continue dealing with them for some time. We were disappointed with $2.73, but when the contract with Klein was drawn up, we didn't know what would be the extent of his contribution to the UNICEF Fund for Bangladesh Children. We expected it to be more than $5 per album. Damn! So, of that $2.27, McCabe attempts to break down exactly what that could account for. He says that the American Federation of Musicians standard cut is 1.05%. In this case, it would be about 13 cents per album. So, McCabe says reliable record industry sources, we don't know who that is, says that the box set and the booklet would cost at most 50 cents. Now, then there's mechanical royalties, which is a 2 cents fee per song per album sold, which goes to usually the publisher and the composer split 50-50. Now, Bangladesh has 19 tracks and songs longer than 5 minutes receive more, and the max amount payable is up to 50 cents, leaving $1.14. Dwarf Music, Dylan's publisher, said that if Bob planned to donate his royalties to UNICEF, he's heard nothing about it. And I think same thing said by the Beatles people. Now, McCabe says it was Klein who said that all monies accrued, including interest, will be turned over to charity. But thus far, Alan Klein has been unavailable for comment about what is happening to all the Bangladesh album proceeds. As John Lennon once said, when Alan Klein doesn't want to talk, he just doesn't answer his phone. You're really seeing the Bangladesh during this. I can't get them straight. Okay, so McCabe goes on to talk about Alan Klein's office, his negotiating style, his lawsuit with Rolling Stone, and jabs back and forth between him and John Eastman. McCabe finally wraps the article with, having brought large record companies to their knees once before, perhaps Klein thought that he could repeat the process with the Bangladesh album. But the fact remains that in Klein's own terms, all proceeds to charity, the Bangladesh album did not call for a heavy showdown across a bargaining table. It demanded a simple pricing structure, which would have accommodated Capitol Records and record dealers in order to get the album marketed quickly and maximize sales. Alan Klein's efforts to recover his lost prestige might have been served had he not left such a staggering array of question marks over the disposal of the Bangladesh album proceeds. As it is, the situation appears to be a sorry mess, a mess made all the more unseemly by the genuine distress of the country which the concert was intended to aid. It's true. So Rolling Stone ran an article shortly after, adding more context, some of it from Klein's side, but also questioning his math. Honestly, no matter where he's published, he looks like an ass. He's not coming out good. On to the Rolling Stone article. Phil Spector calls New York Magazine right after it runs and says Klein is mad, so he communicates his frustration and demands a printed retraction and apology, of which he was denied. Now, Klein had a meeting with the story's editor, name on screen because I don't have it, and Klein says to the editor, "You've been had. All of this is lie." And the editor says, "If we've been had, I'm surely hope we haven't." And because Klein didn't get what he wanted, that printed retraction, he called a press conference at his office announcing his lawsuit that he filed February 28th and a breakdown of the prices. He also uses that meeting with that editor to insinuate that there were mistakes in the article to the press conference. And before I get into the full breakdown of the numbers again, I do want to mention that Brown Meggs, the guy who said that they expected them to donate more than $5 an album, yeah, so he wrote them a letter to the editor and it ran in the next issue of New York Magazine. Here's what he said. "I wish to correct certain of the more glaring inaccuracies and misquotations and statements attributed to me in the article Some Sour Notes from the Bangladesh Concert by Peter McCabe. Neither I nor anyone else at Capitol had anything to do with the retail price of Bangladesh album being $12.98 or fixing the retailer's margin at $2.98. I did not tell Mr. McCabe or anyone else that these figures were agreed upon. Similarly, I did not say anything to Mr. McCabe to the effect that any Capitol personnel expected the contribution to UNICEF be more than $5 per album. I did not know what the contribution was to be and would have no basis for making making the statements attributed to me. Finally, I deny wondering, either aloud or to myself, about the disposition of what Mr. McCabe describes as the $227 balance that was being paid to Alan Klein's company, Abco Industries. The computation of that amount in Mr. McCabe's article contains some apparent inaccuracies, and indeed, Capitol's contract respecting the album is with Apple Records Inc., a California corporation, and not Abco Industries. I would like to state that neither I nor anyone else at Capitol is privy to information regarding the disposition of Bangladesh album receipts by Apple/Klein, and that we have no basis for drawing, nor do any of us attempt to draw any inferences regarding. I trust that, in the interest of accuracy and fairness, you will publish this letter to set the record straight, Brown Megs. So, and then it says, editor's note, it would appear that we erred in reporting that Capitol's contract was with Abco Industries instead of Apple Records, which is managed by Abco Industries. However, on all other points covered in Mr. Meg's statement, Mr. McCabe has notes supporting the accuracy of his reporting, and he and this magazine stand by those points as published. So back to that 227 and 114 and what Klein says about it. Klein goes on to break down the costs of what was going on with zero evidence, both during this press conference and in a 2-page spread in all the trade publications. Rolling Stone said that these cost about $1,500 per page. We'll get into what he says there. At this point, Klein also has all questions sent to his publicists, who are reportedly haughty, brusque, and rude. So the original numbers are on screen that we just went through, brought down to the $2.27. So Klein says that the box and booklet costs 73.1 cents, not 50. AFM was getting 16.5 cents, not 13. A publishing royalty payment, 70.5 cents. Inventory was 65.2 cents. Returns were 9%. Manufacturing, artwork, studio time, and freighting were 20.3 cents. Other manufacturing costs amounted to 20.3 cents. And on a 600,000 sales basis, there was a cost of concert at $1,025 per unit. So Klein concluded that Apple was actually losing money to the sour tune of $329,000 if the album sold 1 million and $18,000 if sales reached 6 million. So Klein's numbers do start to change, and I do apologize, but I'm just going to read this clip about the sliding prices, and it's long. In trade ads, Klein shows his losses decreasing with increasing sales, but he has reduced the amortized cost of concert to a still mammoth $201,000, and returns have been lumped in with artwork, which Camouflage Productions, which did the photos and designing, said cost less than $5,000 in total expenses. Recording studio time, freighting, and other overhead costs in a new sliding figure ranging from 69.9 cents to 52.3 cents. Another difference is inventory at hand figured in, which slide from 65.2 cents on 600,000 units down to 11 cents for 3 million sold. Questions center around the inventory at hand, which no record company executive contacted by this publication could explain. It's tough to figure out what it means, said Stan Cornyn, a vice president at Warner's, after studying the Apple ad. Returns also need explaining, since Capitol had been charged with the manufacture and distribution of the records and had, in fact, declared a stringent returns policies for stores because of the deal forced onto Capitol by Klein. Box/book costs are arguable. Major printers and art directors, reached by Rolling Stone, gave educated estimates ranging from $250,000 to $750,000 for the package. Klein claims it costs more than $900,000, but Klein's figures not only slide, they seem to change, disappear, or reappear at will. In the lawsuit brief, as published by Variety, there is no mention of inventory, but the concert costs go back to up $0.102 amortized, meaning a total cost of more than $600,000 for the use of Madison Square Garden for 2 shows, artist expenses, crews, and Klein knows what else. In news stories at the time of the benefit, it was reported that Abco, as producers of the concert, had spent $50,000. Also, before the New York Magazine article, Klein's LA press agent had provided a breakdown of album costs with the book in the box at 75 cents and a balance of $1.52 per album for returns in general categories, obsolescence, and etc. At that point, the total was $10 clean, no loss mentions. Then one of Abco's publicists said that everyone at Apple is very upset, that it's almost 95% untrue, and I love this. Klein says that he's willing to take the rap, but the story says it appears that the people around him are crooked or that he's led them astray. And they also claim that the McCabe article came as a surprise, but McCabe claims that he reached out to Klein in early February. When Rolling Stone sent in questions to Klein's secretary for this article, the response was sent from Abco's lawyer, Alan Kahn, and it says, "We are advised that you are about to publish an article article embodying information contained in the New York Magazine article. This is to inform you that the information contained in that article is inaccurate, incorrect, and misleading. Accordingly, demand is hereby made that you cease and desist from publishing such an article. If you persist in publishing such information, we will be required to commence all necessary legal proceedings to protect our rights. So Klein went on to drop the lawsuit against New York Magazine, and interestingly enough, this lawsuit was entirely unmentioned. In this book, Alan Klein, the man who bailed out the Beatles, made the Stones, and transformed rock and roll by Fred Goodman. I looked up Bangladesh, it mentioned like, oh, he was charitable, and that was it. And I just thought that was interesting. I just thought it was interesting. That's all I have to say. Okay, bye. George went on to say that there were a lot of people who gave money and they collected on the streets and they talked to UNICEF. They wanted to know what they could do to help. And he said, a lot of people don't do anything unless they're inspired. And on that, it is important, I suppose, that I inspired a lot of people to do something. I mean, I didn't really want the task in the first place. In 1973, George founded the Material World Charitable Foundation, where the royalties from living in the material world went to fund artistic philosophies and other established charities it runs to this day. The George Harrison Fund for UNICEF also donated $8.8 million to UNICEF in 1981. According to Graham Thompson, proceeds from the album and Saul Swimmer's concert documentary had, by the summer of 2011, raked in some $17 million for UNICEF, funding projects not only in Bangladesh but in global trouble spots from Angola to Romania. I don't believe that this is the sort of attitude that George would want us to have, but I think it's one that it's important to remember. This is from Alan Clayson's book. With the concerts for Bangladesh shipwrecks as his sea markers, Bob Geldof would be knighted for Live Aid after 1985, but further back on pop's road to respectability, George's efforts had been rewarded by an elevation to Playboy's Musicians Hall of Fame. He'd received an MBE for less. Live Aid was still 2 years away when he presented a check for a fraction of the concert's net proceeds to Hugh Downs of the U.S. Committee for UNICEF on an American chat show. Accepting a special citation in return, George told the viewers, "It's nice to know you can achieve these sorts of things, even though the concert was 10 years ago and the public has forgotten about the problems of Bangladesh. The children still desperately need help, and the money will have a significant impact." This final sentence here. It was beneath him to vilify those who, in frozen ledgers and computer runoffs, had super taxed the starving, the diseased, and the huddled masses fleeing from terror. That might be a cynical take on things, but it's a realistic one. That's not how Ravi and George view it. They view it from a really joyful thing. That's not how the people of Bangladesh view it. They feel really, really grateful toward George. I found this video from a memorial concert for George. It's really sweet. It's like the worst quality of all time. Actually, a lot of these interviews are really bad quality. However, George said when he first did this, people said, "Oh, he's just doing this to be nice." If George was just doing this to be nice, it's because he is nice. His friend came to him and asked for help, and George wanted to help. So he did. Thank you so much for visiting my land. I would absolutely love it if y'all would like and subscribe and all that jazz. I love y'all so much. And y'all come back now, you hear? Bye.
My sweet Lord. My Lord. My Lord. But it takes so long, my Lord. My sweet Lord.
Give me a minute before I fuck something up. Give me a second. Concert from Bangladesh.